We'll begin this beautiful morning with our first plenary speaker, Professor Kenneth Hamilton, Head of School of Music, Cardiff University from the UK. Today's topic, Chopin and the Eternal Feminine. Professor Kenneth will talk about Chopin and his music in the sense of feminine characteristics that might influence our contemporary approach to his piano music. So, please welcome.
Work. Great. I'm just even wondering whether I need this microphone because you're just right in front of me here, but I'll try. Okay, in that case, I feel a bit like Elton John or something standing here. It's really okay. It's really lovely to be back here. It's for one of several appearances at this really excellent and forward-thinking institution. And I actually looked at my previous presentations here briefly that are now on the internet so I could remember what I'd actually said previously. One, not to contradict myself, and secondly, so that I make sure I said something different. And I also was looking at the accessibility, sustainability, and the woman, which I don't know which particular woman this is referring to, but anyway, the title of the symposium. And one thing that had struck me sort of quite recently was various quotes that I'd read mostly about 19th century music critics, and it leads me to talk today about, as you've just heard, gendered characteristics in classical music, classical romantic music. Now, by gendered characteristics, I don't mean anything that actually necessarily has any basis in reality, because as you will probably have noticed over the last few years, certainly in the West, I don't know about the East, there's been all sorts of gender discussions and attitudes to various aspects of this are changing dramatically. So I'm not talking about necessarily the reality of gendered characteristics in the 19th century. I'm talking about the perception of gendered characteristics in 19th century. And because I'm not particularly interested in theorizing as such when it doesn't actually have a practical application, in other words, I'm interested in philosophy only insofar as it has a pragmatic application. I will try to connect this to our way of understanding and performing music, which I presume is what we're really here about, not to philosophize, but actually to be better musicians or better listeners. So I'm going to circle around the music of Chopin, but I'm not just going to touch on Chopin. And then we can have a little discussion afterwards if anybody is interested. And I titled this to talk Chopin and the Eternal Feminine, partly to distance it from the idea of any specific feminine thing. You know, this was a philosophical idea of female characteristics in the 19th century, and the eternal feminine is a expression in English that's come to be used in all sorts of ways. It probably derives from the final the end of part 2 of Johann Wolfgang von Goethe's Faust, where Faust, this sort of reprobate guy who's made a pact with the devil, is finally redeemed, goes up to heaven, and he is redeemed not really by his own efforts, well, partly by his own efforts. He's redeemed partly because, as the angels say, you know, he who ever strives, the person who never stays still and is always going forward, always trying to do something, you know, he himself creates his own salvation. Wer immer streben sich bemüht, he whoever really tries to strive to go forward, den können wir erlösen, the angels sing or say, he we can save. So now the salvation in the play is partly this, but the other bit of the salvation is the intercession of women, or of a woman, of the female aspect of humanity. And at the very end, and this became an enormously famous passage and was set at the end of the Faust Symphony by Liszt, and was set in a more extensive way as the last section of Mahler's Eighth Symphony. The end of the play, a mystical chorus intones the words, alles Vergängliche ist nur ein Gleichnis. All things that are transient, that pass, are only a parable. Das Unzulängliche, hier wird's Ereignis. The unreachable, the unachievable here becomes an event, here comes an existence. Das Unbeschreibliche, hier ist es getan. The indescribable is here achieved, is done. And then the really significant thing, where the eternal feminine bit comes from. Das ewig Weibliche zieht uns hinan. The eternal womanly, the eternal feminine, it's not really very easy to translate into English. Raises us above, draws us above. So the idea is that it's somehow the female spirit, the female element of humanity that incorporate all the positive things, all the good things, all the things worth striving for. And eventually Faust is redeemed by the intercession of the one woman of Gretchen that he has really severely wronged in his life, but her intercession redeems. And so mankind, in the sense of we guys, right, are redeemed by women in a very romantic sort of way. And virtually every Wagner opera has exactly this as well. In every Wagner opera, there is effectively a redemptive character, and it's almost always a woman from the Flying Dutchman onwards, and it's almost always the redemption is this harmony here. That's the sort of redemptive harmony. In Flying Dutchman, the revised version, you get a wonderful sort of in the revised version, and in the Ring, of course, it goes. Again, etc., etc. So that was sort of Wagner's, if you like, tonal mirror of sort of redemption, usually through the ewig Weibliches, through the eternal feminine. So this is a very strong idea going throughout 19th century literature and music, not just in Germany, but in many other kind of this female spirit, if you like, this female aspect. However, so we have this aspect, but let me give you another quote. Again a musical thing. And this is Henry Fothergill Chorley, a 19th century music critic, talking about Mendelssohn's music. And here we go. He says, demanding, as it does, execution without grimace, fancy, and that means sort of a fancy full of ideas, cheerful and excursive, but never morbid, and feeling under the control of a serene, not sluggish spirit, Mendelssohn's is eminently manly music. Okay? Eminently manly music. And then he carries on and loses effect beyond that of almost any other of his contemporaries when attempted by female hands. In other words, women can't play Mendelssohn. And if you then read back to the beginning of that sentence, it demands execution without grimace. In other words, you shouldn't be going like that or whatever, which is obviously Charlie regards a female characteristic, a serene, not sluggish spirit, cheerful and excursive, and feeling under control. So all of these things that Charlie regards as masculine characteristics and not feminine characteristics. In his master classes in the 1880s, when students would sway around, you'd play and sway around, Liszt would always say to them, "Stop, you're swaying around like Clara Schumann." He said, "Stop swaying around like Clara Schumann." Or as he would say very sarcastically, "Die göttliche Clara," that the godlike Clara. And he would sometimes describe her as the Pope. You know, so he says, you know, she's the Pope, but she still sways around, so you have to stop doing this. So this idea of sort of, if you like, overacting of emotion to the level of morbidity, to use that expression, was regarded as a very strongly female characteristic by many performers, which meant that they shouldn't be playing Mendelssohn's music. Now, the question you might ask, why would it occur to a critic even to mention that in relation to Mendelssohn's music? I mean, you know, and of course the reason is that lots of women played Mendelssohn's music. The Songs Without Words were one of the most famous collections of music accessible to amateurs. Most amateur players in the 19th century were women. Interestingly enough, most professional, it's a bit like chefs in the middle of the 20th century. Most domestic chefs would have been women, but most professional chefs, at least in some countries in the West, were male. So this idea that this idea had grown up that Mendelssohn's music was suited for women, because a lot of women played it, songs without words. So the critics who wanted to, if you like, extol Mendelssohn, to raise Mendelssohn's reputation, would say, no, this is manly music. And this whole thing, this runs through 19th century music criticism in most European countries, especially in Britain, where you find Elgar extolling the future of what he called English music in the early 20th century as needing to express a manly out-of-doors spirit. It's what he said, by which he basically means not homosexual, is as far as I could just summarize it. The out-of-door spirit, I mean, you know, shouldn't be anything, you know, where we don't know what anybody's doing, you know, behind closed doors in the dark. It needs to have a manly out-of-door spirit. And of course, also because for the English, music was inherently suspicious, because it was a sort of foreign thing. You know, you remember the expression of Britain, the description of Britain as the land without music, das Land ohne Musik. Sir Thomas Beecham, the conductor, once very famously said that the English really don't like music, but they quite like the noise it makes. He said, you know, so, which roughly sums up this idea. So now look, I'm quite interestingly, deliberately contrasting this. Because there are these two streams of, if you like, of perceptions of femininity. One is the idealized femininity of das ewig Weibliche, of the eternal feminine, this wondrous better part of human nature that raises above. And the other is this sort of really condemned aspect of femininity, which is sluggish, morbid, decadent, you know, unhealthy, prone to illogical outbursts, which means that women shouldn't be playing Mendelssohn and shouldn't be swaying around. And also, the other implication, and sometimes actually statement, is creativity. The idea was enunciated by many critics was that women's creativity is having children, basically, or as executants, but women themselves don't actually have the ability truly to create. And this goes right through not just the 19th century, but well into the 20th century. We're way beyond these attitudes now, and I'm explaining this in a historical context about how this actually arose. So that there is this idea that the creative element is mostly a masculine one. It comes out extremely strongly in Liszt's essay on Clara Schumann. Where he talks about effectively as Robert Schumann as the creative genius and Clara as a executor of genius, but this is a typical male-female division again. but also says that Clara, that the really talented, really creative executor, in other words, performer, takes the music and makes it his own, and I'm saying his quite deliberately here. While Clara is really good at reading a score and playing something like a priestess of a holy book, he says. I mean, it's quite remarkable. A lot of people seem to think this essay was a compliment to Clara Schumann, was a sort of something designed, and it is ostensibly. But when you start reading it closely, it actually relegates her to the second class of artists. He says she is like a Delphic priestess, like the priestess of the Oracle of Delphi, studying the score extremely conscientiously to make sure she does not miss any note, and she's too terrified to change anything at all, lest she lose any meaning whatsoever in the holy books, is what he says. So she's an artist, but an over-reverential one. This is not truly creative artistry. The funniest thing of all about this article actually is that he then criticizes her, or says it's very strange, for things that we all do routinely now. Then he says she is not a concert pianist in the normal way we think of concert givers. He says for a start, she practices conscientiously. She studies the score in great detail, and she even wants to practice in the hall that she's about to perform in. All of these things, it's like, what is this dame talking about, sort of thing. He then goes, so it's all a very, and notice these are all things that we'd expect as perfectly normal now, but Liszt regards this as an example of her over-conscientiousness. Very, very interesting. Anyway, so these are defined female characteristics in the 19th century, the negative side of the ewig Weibliche, in this sense. Now, how do I get round from here to Chopin? I get round here to Chopin for something that I put in the abstract here, and I found particularly interesting, which was Liszt wrote a book on Chopin just after, or rather, his girlfriend, the Princess Wittgenstein, wrote a book on Chopin, and which Liszt sort of contributed some things to, because Liszt mostly didn't write his own work, his own literary work anyway. So this book on Chopin, ghosted by the Princess Wittgenstein under the name of Liszt, is produced just after Chopin dies in 1849. And of course, Liszt is a huge admirer of Chopin. They were friends in Paris, etc., etc. And he regards this book as being a tribute to his dead friend. But one thing he just, at that point, can't really cope with or understand are the late works of Chopin, the Polonaise Fantasy, the Barcarolle, the Cello Sonata, the things that Chopin wrote just shortly before he died. And this is what he says about them. Here's the quote here. He says, Chopin's latest production, his last productions, he says, were marked by an overexcited sensibility, a morbid irritability, and giving painful intimation of his own sense of suffering and exhaustion. Notice the morbid irritability, overexcited fantasy. These are all, for anybody in the 19th century, these are coded terms which are often used as effectively female sensibility. And especially in terms of the Polonaise Fantasy, he says, such pictures possess but little real value for art. He says, a deep melancholy reigns throughout. They only serve to torture the soul. Deplorable visions, which the artist should admit with extreme circumspection within the grateful circle of his charmed realm. So in other words, the late pieces are utterly condemned. And they're condemned in similar terms to Charlie, describing why women shouldn't play Mendelssohn. Yeah, they're in other, to anybody or most people in the mid-19th century, these are sort of quasi-coded coded gendered terms. Now, a second edition of this book was published in the 1870s, again written by Princess Wittgenstein. And we know this because she wrote that she was living in Rome at the time, and Liszt was elsewhere, in Budapest, I think. And she wrote, she wrote to Liszt saying, "I'm going to produce a second edition of our book on Chopin," she said. And he wrote back saying, "Fine, you do what you like." He said, "There's only one thing I would like you to change." And he said, in the late 1840s, when this book was published, I didn't understand the last works of Chopin. He said, I thought that they were sort of bizarre pieces resulting from Chopin's illness. He said, but now I think I understand them and think they're wonderful. And that he said, I don't think they're quite as good as the late period Beethoven, which were also attributed to illness and deafness, etc., etc. But I now admire them tremendously and think they're well proportioned and moving works. And then he says something really interesting, and he says, Chopin in his own way is incomparable. He is like a female angel with gossamer wings. An Erzengelin is what he writes, an archangel-s. you can't do it in English. So again, we have this sort of what to our mind might be a rather sort of strange gender coding of Chopin, but gender coding of Chopin as female. And I don't think this is, or rather the music is female. And I think in order to understand a bit about how this music is actually received, we need to try to work out why this might have been the case. In other words, we need to know how people reacted to Chopin's music and other composers' music at the time in order to understand the full range of meaning of the music. So let's go back to Mendelssohn. Okay, well, one of the things I said, one of the reasons Charlie was so interested in insisting that Mendelssohn's music was so manly was because lots of women played Mendelssohn's music. And the same is obviously true of Chopin's music, especially of pieces like the Nocturnes. And it's interesting in the Wittgenstein-Liszt book on Chopin, the Polonaises are described as specifically masculine, as manly, but the mazurkas as feminine, as feminine music. Likewise, the Nocturnes are coded as female music, largely because a lot of women, the amateur piano players, the Nocturnes were accessible to these players. So this is the feminine realm. Secondly, most of Chopin's students were female. Just practically in this, because Chopin was a extremely well-paid piano teacher in Paris, and we mustn't forget just how well paid Chopin was. Chopin earned about 20 gold francs per lesson in Paris, which was a massive amount of money. It was even more than Liszt charged. Liszt was the second best paid. To give you an idea how this was, Chopin could, by giving a few piano lessons at that fee, Chopin could earn in 2 weeks what a bank clerk in Paris was paid for a whole year. So this idea of these people as being struggling, impoverished musicians, as we often hear, is actually not necessarily true, at least from about the mid 1830s. 30s onwards. So Chopin is earning an awful lot of money. His fees are extremely high, and the only people that can really afford fees of this level are mostly daughters of the aristocracy. So most of Chopin's pupils are daughters of the aristocracy, or at least of well-heeled students. Wilhelm von Lenz, who is a Russian sort of piano fan, if you like, and took lessons from both Chopin and Liszt in the 1830s, said he waited in Chopin's parlor, and there was just a stream of what he called a stream of beautiful women, each one prettier than the next, would come out and in, is what Wilhelm von Lenz said. So the female coding partly comes from, if you like, Chopin's environment, his pedagogical environment, which is mostly female. But of course, up till now, we've had relatively little access to this aspect because most of the reminiscences about Chopin as teacher came from his male students, like Mikuli. And when I say until now, because there's one thing I want to, until a few years ago, when this massive collection of letters from a student of Chopin's, Friederike Müller, who lived in Vienna at the time and went to study with her aunt as chaperone with Chopin in Paris. There was suddenly, most people didn't know these letters existed. I didn't know they existed. Was suddenly published by Uta Goebel-Streicher, who edited them really, really well. A few years ago. I mean, for those people who don't read German, unfortunately they have never been translated into English or any other language I know at the moment. But the great thing about this is by far the most detailed account of Chopin as teacher that we have ever had by about 1 million miles. Far more extensive, and also far more detailed in terms of what the lessons actually were like. And even more important, they were written immediately after the relevant lessons. Why was this? Because Friederike Müller was a sort of, very enthusiastic music student in her late teens, about 19 at the initial time. She's come from Vienna to Paris, to this sort of center of the musical world. She's extremely excited. She's going to study with her idol Chopin. She studies with Chopin. And she's being financed by one of her other aunts, who's paying for their stay in Paris. So she writes letters back to this other aunt just to say all the things they've studied in lessons, what Chopin's like, what's going on in Paris. And she tells the aunt in huge detail, at least as much detail as you could give to an essential non-musician, about exactly what she studied, what Chopin said, with a huge number of quotes, some in French, some in German. In fact, we now know that Chopin spoke pretty fluent German, which nobody really knew before that, because she quotes him talking French, then occasionally talking in complete units in German. So that this is immediate, effectively almost verbatim discussion and description of what Chopin is actually saying. And so we now know far more about Chopin as teacher than we did before. And we can say from Friederike Müller's letter several things. One is that Chopin did not think of himself as a teacher of basically amateur aristocratic young ladies who were then going to go away and get married and not be professional. Chopin was actually trying to raise professional musicians and had a whole sort of course, effectively, of piano studies on piano technique, including some of the most difficult contemporary music that he gave his pupils to study. In Friederike Müller's case, he also dedicated the Concert Allegro to her, which was originally intended to be the first movement, most people seem to agree, of a third piano concerto that was never actually finished. And from this we can see that Friederike Müller must have been technically an extremely advanced student. This is a very, very difficult piece, one of the most difficult of Chopin's. We can also see from her Tagebücher, from her diaries, that Chopin himself coded music and performance in gender terms, because he said to her at one time, look, he said, you've got a very good hand, you've got a very strong, pretty large hand. He said, he said, your hand is almost as flexible as Liszt's. And she's quoting and saying that, but because you're a woman, you'll be able to be even more sensitive than Liszt. Is what he said. So if you practice a bit more, you could even be better than Liszt, because you have the eternal feminine sensibility. So basically, he buys into all this as well. Well, everybody, these are not unusual opinions in the 19th century, but we actually know now how he actually reacted to his female pupils, and if they were talented enough, then they got a professional training, and they got a professional training that involved all the latest contemporary virtuoso music, because previously. We heard a lot about Chopin teaching Bach and a bit of Beethoven and Hummel and all the best music as such. But it turns out that actually he taught Thalberg Alcan and Liszt's latest virtuoso works, and would say to the students, like Muley, he said, okay, whether you like this music or not, you're going to have to be able to play it because this is contemporary music, and this contains all sorts of piano technique or whatever that you're not going to encounter anywhere. And if you want to be a professional artist, you have to know how to play this. So she plays things like Thalberg's Moses Fantasy. She plays Alcan Capriccios. She plays the Liszt Valse Caprice. She plays the Niobe Fan. All these things that we previously thought that Chopin hated and would never have given to his piano students. And also things that use all sorts of effects that are not in Chopin's own piano music. Effect was this sort of a tune in the middle of the piano thing. Why was it utterly new? It was utterly new because there's basically a three-stranded texture. That was the bass, this middle bit, and then the tune is right in the middle between the two of them. And the point is that it's a pedal effect. You need to be able to manipulate the pedal so that the middle part of the tune that doesn't get blurred but is also sustained. And this is completely new. It's normal. It's normal to have the upper feel nocturne. That's the normal texture. Or you could have a bass tune with something going like that sort of thing. But this thing where suddenly it's in the middle, and at that point it was so new they called it the three-handed effect, because a lot of people couldn't work out how you managed to sustain this, and of course you managed to sustain it by a more sophisticated use of pedal than before. But seems to have actually had quite a lot of interest in, even though he didn't use it in his own piano music. We also know that Mendelssohn had no interest in it, but began to use it because he was told by Ferdinand Hiller that his music would be really old-fashioned if he didn't use that sort of technique. So this tells us something much more about Chopin and his attitude to contemporary piano music. I should say that Sigismund Thalberg, who invented this stuff, and I usually called Thalberg the inventor of cocktail bar piano music, because all the textures that cocktail bar piano music players, and I was one at one time, use are basically first turn up in Thalberg's music. But the interesting thing of it also is, remember the previous comments about Charles about grimacing at the piano, strange expressions. Thalberg was noted for sitting rock still at the piano with no facial expressions at all, and just playing with as little movement as possible, and quite deliberately practiced this apparently by his own account, by practicing while smoking a Turkish pipe, which attached to a sort of little bubbling water thing with the mouthpiece here. So if you're playing a piano with a Turkish pipe, and the Turkish pipe is here, then you have to hold yourself like that and go, and you can't sway back and forward, otherwise you will lose the Turkish pipe. So he quite deliberately practiced like that. Okay, so basically this tells us a lot more about Chopin's environment, his pedagogical approach. and about in a way that the sort of the non-cliches about female students. Sure, he had lots of female students, but he seemed to have treated them exactly the way every other would treat the male students. And finally, we have a lot of detailed documentation of how this worked. So this is the feminine aspect. The second aspect it comes out in the list, and I'll just finish it, is the morbidity aspect, which again is sort of female coded in Chopin. And this comes out in a lot of Chopin criticism, even of some of the early music, this idea that the music is somehow over ornate, over excitable, not straightforward. If you look at the first nocturne, this set of Opus 9 nocturnes, the famous one is very famous, of course, Opus 9, number 2, the famous E flat nocturne. And notice also all three are dedicated to Marie Pleyel, or Madame Camille Pleyel, another at that time very famous female piano player. At one time engaged to Berlioz, quite a character actually. I could be an interesting lecture just on Marie Pleyel, but anyway, dedicated. So female dedication, again, female coded. And this sort of thing, and the very beginning of the very first nocturne, I think gives some idea of why this music might have been regarded as slightly morbid, slightly oversensitive by some. Of course, it's beautiful as well. And the point really, I think, is, and I'm going to stop here, the over profusion of ornamentation, which might have seemed to some critics as over profusion of ornamentation. Not just over profusion, but over profusion right at the beginning. We tend to think of sort of additional ornamentation in these things as something that gradually intensifies. But if you look at this piece and many others of Chopin, there seems to be no particular intensity goal in the lavishness of the ornamentation. In other words, it actually starts off almost as complex as possible, and then to some extent even attenuates slightly through the piece. So let's just see. Okay, that's basically the tune, and just keeps repeating itself in various ways again. Suddenly, first ornamental variation. Think of that as a first ornamental variation. Written as 7, as a phrase of 7 notes. And then down 11. In Chopin's students' copies, there has like little arrows about how to divide up. That ornamentation is not intuitive at all, because in fact the way that it's written out metrically doesn't fit at all with the left hand, which is going da 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 da. And in fact, if you play it exactly as written in the right hand, you can't fit it in at all, unless you slow down massively in the left hand and take about half the time. So there is, in 19th century jazz, there is a morbidity about this. There's a lack of, you don't get anything like this in Mendelssohn. There's a lack of healthiness, if you like, a sense of decadence, which is the final thing that connects up all these things, is this idea of decadence, of sort of emotion heightened to the point of oversensibility. And you get this immediately in the third and fourth bars of Chopin's very first nocturne. So all of these things are basically female coded in the 19th century. And when we listen to Chopin now, I suspect this passes us by completely. We don't think of anything like this. At least I didn't. And the reason I started personally investigating a lot of this was because I found all these sort of female references so extremely strange. Now, I'm telling you this not because I sort of agree with the sort of think there's any objective validity to it, but I think in order to understand languages and cultures and musical languages, we have to understand the meaning that they would have likely have had to at least some people in their own day. In other words, there's a contemporary meaning, and some aspects of this contemporary meaning will be lost through time. And I think it's our responsibility as musicians, as artists, as whatever, to, if you like, recover much of these meanings as possible in order to help us in understanding the music, help us in performing the music. And so what I'm doing here is a little contribution to it. And so in Chopin's music, we basically see the essential contradictions of the 19th century eternal feminine, something that is idolized, extolled, something that raises us to heaven, is so pure, ineffable, and wonderful, but something that is also criticized for basically not being masculine enough, and being essentially unhealthy and possibly decadent as well. If you want to summarize it, it's also partly why Chopin's music is so interesting. Chopin, the eternal feminine, the eternal idea in the 19th century of decadence. Thank you very much. And I'm finished, so I don't need the microphone. Thank you. We have a few minutes for conversation or questions, I think. Don't we? Is that right, Anatol?
Yes, that is right.
Yeah. Okay. So please, if anybody wants to say something or criticize or ask, yeah. How you doing?
Thank you very much for your wonderful presentation about Chopin and music and movement. I just want to add one opinion that actually the keyboard instrument can be regarded as instrument for female also, like from the harpsichord or early pianoforte, that it was an accompanied instrument. So it's not the main melodies, so they cannot play legato line until the invention of, let's say, double escapement from era that emerged virtuosic piano music, right? So as you said, Chopin has a lot of female students, Mozart, Beethoven as well. So I think the piano music, which great composer also wrote, they had some female expression as anyway, yeah. So as a female instrument, so the male play violins in the chamber music, sister play piano. That is usual in the 19th and 18th century.
Yeah, exactly. Nice. Yeah, I mean, and for the same reason, cello was not regarded as a suitable instrument for women to play, for obvious reasons. If you know, for the way the position you have to adopt playing a cello, so all these ridiculous sort of sexual codings about what is suitable and what isn't. But yeah, you're quite right. Notice Notice that Charlie also says Mendelssohn's music loses its effect under the hands of a woman. In other words, he doesn't say women singers, because obviously if you're going to say, if there's a female voice part, then it's going to be a woman singer. But it's specifically keyboard music he seems to be referring to, and no doubt songs without words. Yeah, thank you. Is that us? I think that's us. Okay, in that case we can get on to it. Thank you very much, ladies and gentlemen.